Yo, welcome back to Kempf Fitness Pro, everybody. I had a few of you asking a question about windshield wipers, and I figured it was worth making a little bit of a tutorial video to explain some of the nuances because you will have a better understanding of the exercise and the movement pattern. And ultimately, the movement pattern is the important part because the larger archetypical movement pattern of this posterior pelvic tilt, lumbar flexion, legs up position when we're on our back is going to carry over to multiple exercises as far as regressing and progressing the exercise and overall mechanics of the exercise or of the movement pattern, which will apply the same to the the different exercises that use the same movement pattern. For example, a windshield wiper and a dead bug and a leg lift are all very similar movements where we're on our back with our legs up in the air, and there's a few other ones as well. But the kind of idea of what to do with your core and how to position your body for maximal effectiveness of the exercise, but also to optimize your form and reduce injury risk is really important. So it's worth noting here. And let's see, I thought there was one other piece I was going to address, but we're just going to wing it. If it comes back to me, cool. But the idea here with the windshield wiper is to focus on the rotational core, the rotary core, stabilizing through rotation and ultimately resisting rotation. And that sounds a little counterintuitive because we're twisting from side to side, but ultimately what we're trying to do is decelerate and control and stabilize and stop the legs from rotating too far past midline, past your center of gravity, and then not being able to control the legs coming back to the midline. And that's where you can have issues with over rotation, especially in the lumbar spine, that we want to be mindful of. And ultimately, we're likely not getting a very good contraction if we're letting our legs go all the way down. So just to give you a demo of what you would expect to see and what you may have even seen in the video, because that video is not super clear, I have really good thoracic mobility, thoracic rotational mobility, which means I can rotate my rib cage really well, my upper back really well. And that's actually what we're doing more in this exercise, or emphasizing the intent is to try to build mobility in the thoracic spine and focus less on rotating from the lumbar spine. So typically when you'll see a windshield wiper done at like an LA Fitness common gym, it's just this side to side thing. So when I'm rotating here, my pelvis is coming all the way to a side position. So I'm 90-degree rotation in my pelvis. So all that rotation, if my rib cage is flat and my pelvis is at 90, that means from my rib cage to my pelvis, there has to be 90 degrees of rotation. So that's coming completely from my lumbar spine. You could argue a few of the lower thoracic vertebrae as well, but mainly my lumbar spine is doing 90 degrees of rotation. And now when we look at typical range of motion and ideal mobility for the lumbar spine, 90 degrees of rotation is too much. The lumbar spine isn't meant to rotate 90 degrees like that, especially under a lot of load, and that actually can be a factor for causing back pain or injury. We rather would have the rotation come from the upper back more so, and more stability from the lumbar spine. So the goal isn't actually to get your legs from side to side. And typically you'll see the legs even go down as they go away from the body, and then you lift them up to the center and then down. So now we're introducing this element of lumbar extension as well, some anterior pelvic tilt and lumbar extension as we come down, especially if we don't have good control. So now we're extending and rotating the lumbar spine. Absolutely something we do not want to do, especially again under load, especially again when we're fatigued. That's where you're going to not notice it per se in the session, but then later, like, I kind of hurt my back. My low backs are bugging me a little bit. Maybe it's because we cranked on some tissues beyond their ideal range of motion and capacity. So instead of thinking about this exercise as how far can I get my legs from the side, if my legs touch the ground, I did it right. Instead of having that idea of east, west, left, right, I want you to think first and foremost with all of these exercises about the position of my low back, my rib cage, my pelvis from this beginning position here. And so when I'm on my back with my legs up like this in this dead bug, leg lift, windshield wiper kind of position like so, one thing to note is I want to create some tension in my core here. So if I were to smack myself, my belly's not soft. See how a soft belly I can push in? Now watch, when I tense it up, my hand pushes out. You might not be able to see that amazingly on the camera, but you can get the idea here of creating some tension there, some intra-abdominal pressure, trying to compress everything around your spine and create some bracing in the trunk, bracing in this region from pelvis to rib cage. Okay, so that's the first thing I want to think about doing. To encourage that bracing and squeezing and compression, and for all of these exercises, we want to try to actually get a little bit of pelvic tilt and lumbar flexion. I actually want to get my butt cheeks off the ground. I want to try to get a little bit of daylight underneath the back of my sacrum, that area where your belt goes or the back of your waistband for your shorts. I want to try to get that part right there off the ground. Because when I get it off the ground, I'm essentially these ropes that are going from here to here, all the way from this surface all the way to my spine. When I pull my pelvis up, these muscles are pulling this rope. They're shortening this rope. They're contracting the core muscles. They're compressing the accordion, if you were to think about these as tissues. Okay. Okay, so if I can bring either my rib cage towards my pelvis or my pelvis towards my rib cage, I can compress the accordion on both sides, or one or the other of the sides. Okay. So when I tilt my butt up like so, I'm compressing that accordion from the bottom. So I'm really compressing a lot of the deep core muscles here. And that alone is going to give you a much more intense and effective stimulus than just leaving the legs at neutral here and not creating any of that compressive force by tucking my thigh bones into my chest and getting my sacrum off the ground. Okay, so that's step number one in this windshield wiper, and ultimately the idea that you want to carry over to your other exercises that are similar to this movement pattern, i.e. the dead bug, is we want to really focus on that tilting of the pelvis. Another cue you'll often hear, if you go search RNT dead bug, or just go to the tutorials playlist on Kempf Fitness Pro, you'll see the dead bug video where I've got a band under the low back, and it's very similar to this position. I'm cueing to push down into the low back. So I'm creating a little bit of thoracolumbar flexion, a little bit of top-down compression of the accordion in that cue, as well as that bottom-up compression by pulling the tailbone off the floor. So if you use the cue of pushing your low back into the ground, you should start to feel that same compressive sensation. So play around with those two cues of get the sacrum off the ground by tilting and tucking your butt up off the floor, almost like you're pushing your knees towards the ceiling as you pull your thighs in towards your chest. Okay, and you're trying to get that elevated position. A couple inches, doesn't have to be much. This, compared to that, is immensely more challenging. You'll see when you try it. Okay, so just a little bit of tuck and compression as I push that low back into the ground, and that creates that braced core. Okay, now another note on these exercises, that now that we've talked about the primary goal of creating that braced compressive trunk, is thinking about leg length, so you can maintain a braced trunk with optimal form and keep the low back in the best position. Because during the exercise, we don't want that low back peeling off the ground. Remember I was saying on the windshield wiper, those legs can come down. You'll probably get a good view of it here. And now you can see that big kink in my spine here and the arch in my back as my rib cage flares up and my pelvis tilts forward. Okay, and I just felt a pop in my back that was like not a good chiropractic pop. So a ton of extension and excessive rotation, not ideal, right? So we want to make sure that we keep compressed as we rotate. Okay, so as opposed to, again, going all the way side to side, I don't really feel it, John. This is really easy. I've had people come in who are in very, very low physical condition, poor physical condition, say this exercise is easy. Okay, that means we're not doing it right. That means we need to adjust on cue. So if you feel that on any exercises, something doesn't feel right, pain, or it's too easy or something, let me know, and or film yourself, and then we'll break it down, because it's probably one of these little tiny cues that we're working on to totally change the exercise. That little bit of compression, thigh to rib cage, thigh to chest. Okay, and then we rotate from here and just try to keep your knees coming towards your face / towards the ceiling, aka keeping that sacrum off the ground as much as you can as you do this exercise. Now it's all sorts of harder here because I'm actually holding all of those bones and tissues up off the floor instead of just letting gravity push them into the floor and not let the muscles do the work. Okay, so now I don't even have to go very much side to side. If you guys would see this from this angle, hopefully that works for you guys. I'm really only going about maybe 30 to 45 degrees, thinking on a clock, 10 o'clock, 2 o'clock. Okay, right there is as far as I need to go. And I actually can get up a little higher. Oh, now that's harder. And now look at that. I don't have to rotate as far, and I actually feel it more. And so to kind of give you guys a little bit bigger visual reference of this exercise as a movement pattern that will be turned up and turned down in difficulty, progression or regression, but same archetypical movement pattern and same contraction of tissues, overall intention of the movement. If anybody's familiar with CrossFit, maybe not, think about this exercise here. Hang from a pull-up bar. So I'm actually on my back, but if you were to turn me 90 degrees, I would be facing straight up with my hands over my head, right? If you put a bar over my head, I'd be hanging on a bar. Okay, so this exercise here is called a toe to bar. If you were to imagine I'm hanging from a bar, my feet are right below me, and I pull my feet all the way up, and I tuck my butt up and punch it into the air, and I touch my toes to the bar that I'm hanging from. This is called a toe to bar, T2B. It's a really popular in CrossFit exercise. You're coming up, touching the bar, and back down. So it's the most difficult progression of a leg lift because you're fighting gravity and holding your own body weight and hanging. Now, toe to bar with rotation, a hanging windshield wiper. You may have seen some crazy extreme pull-up YouTube videos floating around. If so, you see the guys, they're hanging like this, and then they do the windshield wiper from side to side, and they touch wrist to wrist to wrist to wrist. That's actually what we're doing here with the windshield wiper. That's more of the intention. I have my arms out to the sides here because I'm not hanging from a bar vertically. I'm laying on my back, going a little bit more left to right, and I need to use my arm to push into the floor to give myself that stability needed to stop the legs and bring them back to center. Okay, so resisting excessive rotation. Squeeze, stop. Bring it back to midline. So if you were to think, if my arms were up overhead and I was hanging, I'd be able to fight against something. I'd be able to pull against something. And I could bring my feet here without my arms coming up off the ground. But that's the idea of I'm more focusing on my windshield wiper with the intention at max progression to imagine my hands were up overhead and I was going toe to wrist, toe to wrist, toe to wrist. So I'm at that 10 o'clock, 2 o'clock with my hands, okay? The same thing's happening, 10 o'clock, 2 o'clock, toe to wrist with the intent, except my arms are actually down here. I'm still trying as much as I can to get my legs to go up this way and create more of that compressive force that's going to give me more of an ab workout, put me in a better position, minimize my risk of over-rotating my spine and creating any kind of low back injury. But it's also prepping you for the progression of the movement through the same cues, except you're on your back. So for those of you that can't hang from a bar and do toe to bars, because that's a crazy hard ab exercise, you can still elicit the same kind of response and get that same kind of intensity, but with better technique and better form, and do so in a regressed position. So I want you to think more about tucking up and getting your sacrum off the ground and rotating from there and focusing on really squeezing and compressing when those legs get out to the side and stopping and being like kung fu precise with the statuesque squeeze and hold at that end of the twist before you bring it back to the midline. So that way you're really working on the control pausing here, coming back, over, pausing here, coming back, over. Okay, this is the level 10 version that's really exaggerated, okay? Don't expect to be ninja status and get your butt all the way up off the ground and with straight legs and be able to go wrist to wrist totally fine. All of those cues are going to make this a lot harder for you. That's ultimately the goal, ideally, so that way you've got some room to grow into this exercise and get better at it. But if we need to regress on any of these movements that ask of us a supine position where we're on our backs with our legs up in the air using a lot of deep core muscles, the longer the leg, the harder the exercise, okay? Whether it's a dead bug or a leg lift with 2 legs or all sorts of other variation, pelvic tilts or windshield wipers, the straighter the legs, the harder it's going to be. The shorter the legs, the easier it's going to be. Now, there isn't really an in-between, right? To show you guys, like, well, there's this exercise variation and there's this exercise variation, but maybe you're somewhere in here where your first couple reps you can go straight legs and you start to shake a little and then your core hurts and then your low back almost starts to peel up. You're like, if I go another rep with straight legs, my low back's gonna lift off the ground, and then I'm shutting off my ab muscles and putting my low back at risk. I'm not doing the exercise right. I'm teaching myself a bad pattern. Stop, right? Regress to progress. Keep the form peak. So if I know if I do another rep like this, I'm not going to have good form, but I got a little more than this, right? Then it's somewhere in here for a rep or 2. And then I'm like, oh, feeling it. Okay, bend it a little more. And then next set, maybe I finish here when I'm fatigued. And then the next workout, I try to keep my legs a little straighter the whole time. So the idea is to progress appropriately, challenge yourself appropriately, where you are able to finish all 5 sets, whatever the prescribed sets are, but you are challenged to do so. You wouldn't be able to do a whole bunch more reps because you're doing a difficulty that's just right. Now, if you're someone who has adequate strength in this movement and you feel like you're ready to progress to a greater difficulty, great. Let's see that with the tracking. Let's see, sets of 10, do a video of yourself 1 set. Am I tucked up high enough? Does this look good? Because if you can go all 10 sets with your sacrum totally tucked up and your legs totally straight, then what do we need to do? Progress the movement pattern to a more difficult variation to get you a little bit more of a stimulus that you need to elicit an adaptation and growth response. So if you can't do it with straight legs, then bend the knees and start there and minimize the movement pattern and just work on getting your pelvis tilted up off the ground 1 more millimeter each rep, 1 more millimeter each exercise session, each set, each week. So you'll progress appropriately through the windshield wiper with the straightness of the legs or the dead bug or these other exercises based on where you're at, and use the difficulty level 1 to 10 when you're tracking it to find that out. So if you do 5 sets of 8 reps, that's pretty good. Like maybe you are ready to progress, but then I see difficulty 10 out of 10. I couldn't have gotten another rep, like 8 maxed me out and like my abs are really sore. Then we just stay there, right? Like if that's a peak difficulty, we don't need to challenge you more. Let's just master that and make it a little bit easier, get a little more comfortable with that. Then we progress it. So track your results as you go. And if you have any questions, film yourself doing any of the exercises or movement patterns and then send me an instant message and I'll check that out. But I hope that helped for supine core exercises and a little bit more specifics on the windshield wiper. If you've got any questions off of this video, leave them in the comments or shoot me an instant message on the app, and I'll see you guys soon.